A thin fog curled over the scorched soil of the northern fiefdoms, masking the smell of rot and ash that rose from burned-out hovels. What was once a village lay in silence, its people either taken by plague or blade. Amid this ruin, soldiers dragged carts for inspection, looking not for loot but for life. From a cellar blackened by fire, a boy was pulled, barely breathing, dirt on his face, but with eyes so hauntingly familiar that the captain stopped mid-command. They did not kill him. Instead, they brought him south. The journey was quiet. The boy neither cried nor spoke. His silence disturbed the men. When they reached Castle Elmond, he was taken not to the dungeons, but through golden halls lined with tapestries of the dead prince, the king's only child, lost weeks prior to the coughing plague. The resemblance was staggering. Not perfect, but close enough for madness. The boy was cleaned, dressed in linen, presented as a divine sign to a grieving monarch who had not spoken a full sentence in days. When he looked into the boy's face, something cracked. He smiled. The court whispered. The bishop declared it providence. God had returned the boy to the king to test his heart and faith. The child was renamed immediately Sporus, a name drawn from old texts, spoken with reverence, though none there truly knew what it meant. The physician who had embalmed the prince was summoned. He inspected the boy, probing his limbs, his face, his throat. "We can preserve him," he said, "as he is now, unchanging." What followed was not spoken of openly. Sporus awoke to pain like fire, fever, and blood between his legs. He cried out once, and no one came. They told him it was necessary to become something more than flesh, a symbol, a living vessel for royal memory. The king came the next morning, sat beside the bed, and stroked his hair, whispering a name that wasn't his. Sporus tried to ask where his mother was, but the steward shook his head. "You don't speak of that anymore." Food was brought in silence. Servants entered with eyes downcast. In the mirrors he was no longer allowed to look into, he began to forget what his own face had once been. They dressed him in silk robes, laced his hair with oils, trained him to walk with precision, to hold his hands like a prince. When he faltered, he was corrected. When he cried, he was ignored. Rumors spread that the prince had truly returned. Commoners waited outside the gates for a glimpse. No one questioned the lie. It was safer to believe. Prophets claimed the boys. Rebirth was the kingdom's reward for surviving plague. Priests revised sermons. Songs were rewritten. Sporus stood silent in the cathedral, forced to listen to verses written about him, for a boy he never knew, whose shadow now wore his skin. One night, he whispered his real name aloud, only to feel it vanish from his tongue like mist. His hands trembled as he tried to recall his village, the smell of bread baking, the sound of bees in summer. Nothing came. He was not dead, but he had been erased. The king gave him a small carved horse, the same one the prince used to play with. "You remember this?" he asked. Sporus nodded. He learned early that pretending was safer than honesty. The guards called him my lord. The nobles bowed to him. But at night, in his chamber, he clutched the wooden horse like it might take him home. He was kept from other children. Too fragile, they said, too sacred. A priest told him once he was chosen, that few in life were honored with a holy purpose. But Sporus knew better. He was not chosen, he was convenient. A face close enough to fool a man drowning in grief. A doll carved into someone else's memory. And that was when he understood. He did not belong to himself anymore. Not his body, not his voice, not even his soul. The mornings began before the sun touched the towers. A bell echoed across the stone corridors, and Sporus rose in silence. He washed in cold water, dressed in stiff brocade that chafed his skin, and was escorted by a servant who never met his eyes. He ate alone at a carved table, always the same, half an egg, dry bread, and watered wine. Not too much, they warned. lest his features change. He was walked down corridors, paraded like an icon. His hands were taught to stay folded, his mouth closed unless spoken to. At mid-morning, the steward read aloud chronicles of the prince's life, and Sporus listened, memorizing memories that were not his. He was corrected constantly, how he blinked, how he sat, how he smiled. They told him what the prince would have done. When he forgot, they scolded gently. When he resisted, their tone hardened. In the chapel, incense thickened the air, masking the scent of mold. Sporus was placed on a marble stool beside the king, unmoving. The bishop preached about sacrifice, piety, and divine submission. Heard the words, but never knew if they were meant for him or the kingdom. Once, during Vespers, he coughed. 3 days of confinement followed, to preserve the image. Every moment of defiance became a threat to their illusion. The castle was not silent. Behind its walls, laborers toiled, kitchen girls bled from their hands, and rats swarmed the cellars. Sporus heard the screams of punishments echo in the courtyard. A stable boy lost a hand for stealing cheese. A maid vanished after speaking too kindly to him. Fear held the stones together more than loyalty. His only contact came from the old nurse, Lady Hemma, who never called him by name. She rubbed ointment into the scar tissue on his thighs and whispered psalms while avoiding his gaze. Once, she muttered, "The world punishes beauty," and said no more. Dust settled thick in his chamber. Sporus watched spiders spin webs in the corner, his only witnesses. There were days he was made to stand for hours, wearing the prince's ceremonial robe while artists tried to recreate his likeness. They painted over his eyes. One painter asked to paint him as he wasn't adorned. The request was denied, and the man was sent away. Illness spread in the lower halls and the kitchens. Stew grew thinner. The nobility still dined in excess. Sporus, despite his porcelain image, felt weakness bloom in his limbs. He was not permitted to rest. His routine never faltered. Rise, cleanse, posture, prayers, recitation. He repeated lines like chants, not knowing which were true and which belonged to a boy long dead. At night, he heard weeping, sometimes from the servants' quarters, sometimes from within his own throat. He muffled the sound with pillows. He dared not speak to anyone. Even the guards stationed at his door looked at him as if he were a vision they feared would vanish. If touched during feast days, he was seated beside the king before crowds. They cheered, as if the prince had risen from the grave. Sporus smiled when commanded, raising his cup with hands that trembled. He could feel their eyes pierce through him, searching for signs of failure. He learned to hold his breath too still. The shaking applause meant safety. Indifference meant suspicion. He once asked if he could walk in the gardens. Permission was denied. Too much sun might change his complexion. Instead, they brought flowers to his room and placed them in a silver vase. When the petals wilted, no one replaced them. He forgot the taste of honey, the feel of grass underfoot, the sound of real laughter. There were no seasons in his life, only repetitions. Time blurred. The past he came from faded, and the future was forbidden. All that remained was a tight circle of rules and expectation, wrapped around him like iron wire. Each day Sporus rehearsed perfection. Each night, he buried what was left of himself deeper. His body remained young. His spirit did not. He was not growing. He was being preserved, like a relic under glass. Still breathing, but no longer alive. The winter struck hard. Ice formed on the castle walls, and the corridors reeked of damp straw and smoke. Sporus began to cough again, deeper this time. His skin paled, and the shadows beneath his eyes grew darker, but the court physician insisted. He must not rest. He was scrubbed harder, painted brighter, made to appear untouched. The resemblance to the late prince had dulled. His face sharpened with age, and the softness they once cherished was fading. Whispers spread like frostbite, the magic wearing off. Was he still sacred? The king had grown more withdrawn, his gaze colder. He no longer stroked Sporus's hair. Now, he observed him like an object he couldn't remember buying. A scholar suggested painting new images of Sporus to match his current look. The king refused. "He is not changing," he snapped. "He is what he was." The court bowed and nodded. Behind closed doors, the steward asked the priest whether a blessing might restore the illusion. The bishop proposed a cleansing rite. Sporus was stripped of his garments and anointed in bitter oil. He stood in the nave, surrounded by chanting monks, while wax was dripped on his arms, and verses were spoken over his head. He didn't flinch. He had learned stillness was survival. But that night, something inside him cracked. He stole a piece of charcoal from a chambermaid's basket and marked the back of his wardrobe with crooked lines, his attempt at the face he once knew. It came out wrong. His hand shook too much. The next morning, the mark was discovered. The steward dragged him before the king, accused him of defilement, heresy, madness. The king stared long at Sporus, and then turned away. "Lock him," he said, "until the spirit repents." The dungeon was colder than the castle halls. Stone walls dripped with slime. Rats scurried nearby, and the air was thick with mildew. Sporus sat on bare rock. He didn't scream. He had forgotten how. 3 days passed. No food. On the 4th, a monk arrived, silent, handed him a wooden cross, and left without a word. He stared at the object for hours. He did not pray. His faith, once faint and flickering, had long been smothered under rituals designed to break, not save. He tried to speak his name again. Nothing came out. His voice had grown thin, like string unraveling. When they brought him back to the castle, they avoided his eyes. No artist approached him again. He was given plainer clothing. They claimed it was a sign of humility. In truth, they were preparing to move him elsewhere. The king could not bear the resemblance fading. It was no longer comfort. It was failure. The memory he tried to replace was slipping away again. Sporus had become a reminder of grief, not its solution. A feast was held that month for foreign envoy. Sporus was not invited. For the first time since his arrival, he was locked in his room during court ceremony. He heard laughter below and the distant echo of music. He sat against the wall, clutching his knees, watching a single candle burn. Its flame danced for hours, then died in silence. The darkness felt familiar. The next morning, he saw the nurse. Again, she didn't speak. She handed him coarse bread and left. Even her face now carried shame. He noticed a mirror had been removed from the far wall, where once they had forced him to study himself. Now they feared what he might see, or what others might see in him. In desperation, he asked a passing servant, "Where is the king?" The servant answered without stopping, "With the new one." That night Sporus sat in the corner, not sleeping, not crying, just listening to the wind press against the shutters. He knew what it meant. Someone else had been found, another face, another vessel. He was no longer a symbol, just a boy with a scar and no name. The priests still visited, they still demanded prayers. But their eyes had already moved on. So had the world. Sporus began to speak aloud, in whispers, not to be heard, but to remember the sound of a voice that belonged to no one else. The carriage moved before dawn, no ceremony, no farewell. Sporus was seated between two monks, neither of whom spoke. The wheels groaned through frozen mud as the castle faded behind him. No one came to see him off, not even the king. He was being sent to the Abbey of St. Merwin, a place whispered about by servants where those who embarrassed the crown were placed out of sight, beyond memory. The abbey stood on a wind-beaten hill, surrounded by leafless trees and crumbling graves. The brothers there greeted him without welcome. They shaved his head, gave him a plain wool robe, and assigned him to silence. No name, no questions. The stone floor where he slept was shared with others. a girl declared mad for speaking to statues, an old knight whose war wounds never healed, and a boy who twitched uncontrollably at the sound of bells. None spoke unless asked. Most had long stopped trying. Sporus ate once a day a bowl of thin broth and a crust of bread. He scrubbed floors, carried water, stacked wood, all in silence. His hands bled from the cold. His legs trembled under weight. No oil-scented baths, no velvet robes, no music. But for the first time in years, no one watched him. He was not corrected, not reshaped. He was invisible. His body had changed. Gaunt, sunken-eyed voice nearly gone. What remained was barely boy, barely human, something in between. One of the monks, Brother Tellin, watched him often, not cruelly, but with the gaze of a man who recognized ruin. One night, he left a scrap of parchment near Sporus's cat, with a single word written. Asterisk, remember. Asterisk. Sporus tried. He stared at the word for days. He whispered his birth name again and again, but it remained just out of reach, like a dream you wake from too quickly. He drew in the dirt lines and shapes from the village he once came from, but they meant nothing to the others. He thought of the carved horse the king gave him. It had been left behind, or taken, or burned. Like everything else, the winters were long. Snow piled against the abbey walls. One by one, those around him faded. The girl was taken to another convent. The knight died in his sleep. The boy with the twitch stopped breathing after a fever. Graves were dug quietly. No prayers, no names. Just earth over forgotten lives. Sporus grew weaker. His limbs felt hollow, his steps unsteady. Still, he carried water and lit candles. He did not cry. There was no audience for sorrow. He felt nothing. When the monks spoke of sin, of divine will, those words had no meaning anymore. They were used to shape him, and when he no longer fit, they discarded him. He died in late autumn. No illness, no wound. Just faded, like a shadow stretched too thin. His body was placed in a shared grave with 3 others. No marker, no ledger entry. His name was not spoken. The abbey recorded a number. The castle never asked what became of him. Years passed. The king remarried. A new child was born. The old prince's tapestries were removed, replaced with newer, brighter ones. The story of the returned boy faded to rumor, then myth. A few scribes mentioned him in footnotes, often confused with tales of changelings or saintly apparitions. Scholars debated whether he ever existed at all in the ruins of Castle Elmond. Long after its abandonment, a traveler once found scratches beneath crumbling plaster, letters, faded and crooked, carved by an uncertain hand. They did not form a name, just fragments of something lost. No one could read them, but they remained outlasting kings, wars, and memory. The world moved on, and Sporus was left behind, buried under silence, beneath a history that never wanted him. His story, like countless others, was swallowed by a time that only recorded what served power. The rest turned to dust, forgotten, as intended.